Welcome to the Nations of Sanity. It's my great pleasure to welcome Robert Wenzel, who's been very kind to give up his time to have a conversation with me about his work and mine. He is the author of a book, Foundations of Private Property Society Theory, Anarchism for the Civilised Person, which is a theory that he himself has created and is detailed in his book. And just before I hand over to Robert to introduce himself in a little bit more detail, I was just going to quote Walter Block and what he had to say about the book. Walter Block said, there are very few who initiate a whole new philosophy, utilitarianism or libertarian or anarcho-capitalism or whatever it is, with this book, Foundations of Private Property Society Theory, Anarchism for the Civilised Person. Wenzel is now one of them. The book also contains the best short introduction to why we need society and the best short critique of utilitarianism. And I'm just going to pass it over to Robert Wenzel to introduce himself a little bit more formally now, and also just to thank Robert again for taking the time to have this conversation.
Yeah, sure. Okay. For listeners who may not be familiar with my work, my main work and my main writing are done at two blogs, economicpolicyjournal.com and also Target Liberty, which is targetliberty.com. In addition to the Foundations of Private Property Society book, I've also written a book called The Fed Flunks, My Speech at the New York Federal Reserve Bank, and suffice to say, I probably won't be invited back to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York after writing that speech. So if someone wants a few chuckles and an anti-Federal Reserve perspective, that would be a book to pick up. And basically, that's it. I've been writing Economic Policy Journal now for about 10 years, and I have spent most of my time before that on Wall Street, but now spend most of my time strictly writing with the blogs, and I've got a couple of other books that are in development stage. So those should be fun when they come out. Over to you, Matthew.
Thank you. Just wanted to ask you to also just give a basic rundown of your private property theory, because one of the reasons why I wanted to speak to you about it was because obviously I'm presenting, the Nations of Sanity is presenting this idea of establishing the non-aggression principle as law as a way to create a free society, which we propose doing through a peace agreement, specifically a three-part peace agreement. Now, obviously, your ideas go in a very different direction, and there's obviously a few areas where we'll probably have some disagreement, which I'm very interested in discussing with you. Because one of the main things that struck me about yours is basically you're just focusing on the issue of property, and correct me if I'm wrong here, almost doing away with the non-aggression principle.
Yeah. Well, I'm not exactly doing away with the non-aggression principle. I'm approaching it from a different perspective. I mean, most people, when they look at the non-aggression principle, they have a utilitarian or natural rights perspective, and I reject both the utilitarian and natural rights perspective. I reject the utilitarian basis with the arguments that the natural rights people make, that you can't measure the utility of a society. An individual can rank his choices and what he prefers, but for a society overall, you can't do that. It violates the subjective value theory. I then go on and reject the natural rights theory based upon the idea that in the manner in which the natural rights people reject the utilitarians reject the natural rights theory, and that is that there seems to be really no basis. It's a bit mythical in the sense that there are natural rights. There's Henry Hazlitt, who was very close to Mises and wrote a book on morality, argued that the natural rights theorists were close to being mystical about it. And so I sort of accept that. There's just, you can say you have a right for this or a right for that, or non-aggression principle people will try and get cute and say, well, there are rights, but there are only negative rights and not positive rights. Well, who says that there are only negative rights and not positive rights, and vice versa? So basically you have a situation where you have something that you either accept whole cloth without any substantiation behind it and say this is a right, and then you fall into the danger of positive rightists saying, well, if you can say that's a right, I can say this is a right. So that's what causes me to reject the natural rights theory. And what I do from there is I say, okay, so what do we have? We don't have utilitarianism. We don't have natural rights. Most of us, there might be a few people that don't, but most of us prefer having some kind of property, if for no other reason, to be able to go to sleep in the same place every night and not having to worry about trying to find a place to sleep, or a place to sleep that isn't dangerous, a place where we can accumulate things beyond what we can carry and keep them in the same spot as opposed to moving them. Now, again, you might be able to argue that nomads don't hold this perspective, but for most people want some kind of property, whether they own it themselves, they rent it for someone, and you use it that way. So my argument to get to the non-aggression principle is, hey, if I've got a property and now I'm looking at a society that sort of is just establishing property, people using different property, and I want my property, I know there's people out there that can be aggressors and may want to steal what's on my property or go on my property. So what I argue from there is you can see very easily where you could have a situation where you have a property, there's a person next to you that has a property, and third person over here, and you might get together and say, hey, look, you got a property, I got a property. We can spend all time fighting, stealing things on each other's property. Why don't we just set up a rule? You can do whatever you want on your property. I can do whatever I want on my property, and let's leave each other alone beyond that. And so that's really fundamentally why I call it a private property society theory, because it's based on the idea that private property for almost all of us is very, very important. And basically it's a situation where recognition of the importance of private property can, from that point, lead to a philosophy of non-aggression that is not based on natural rights and utilitarianism, which I both feel are weak at the foundation. So I don't really reject the non-aggression principle. I sort of consider that on property the best way to really sort of keep rules, but I come at the idea that what should be allowed in the sense of interaction versus on a some kind of theoretical basis that it's absolutely right is that, hey, I'll leave you alone on your property, you leave me alone on my property, and we can go on from there. Now, of course, you can roll out, well, how do you protect your property? You know, what's going to happen if somebody interferes on your property? And, you know, that's when we get into more of the book. But that fundamentally is at the core of private property society.
Does it distinguish rightful ownership or define rightful ownership? Does it distinguish it from, you know, say, your house, like for example, your property that you acquired? Obviously, because for me, coming from it from a non-aggression principle, obviously, from my point of view, the non-aggression principle is how you, first of all, it's how you get property rights in the first place, but it's also how you distinguish rightful ownership from what's not rightfully yours. In other words, what you bought or created yourself or voluntarily traded for being rightful means of attaining property rights, rightful ownership, or whether you've stolen it. So is there is there a distinction there, or is it just a case of possession being the basis for property ownership and rightful ownership?
Yeah, well, see, again, you're using the term rightful, and I reject that there are any natural fundamental rights. We can make structures as to how people own things, but I tend to get away from arguing that they're rights somehow coming on up from above. Okay, so my argument in my book is if we were to introduce a private property society now, what we would do is just sort of accept the property that everyone owns now, based on the idea that it's sort of a way to sort of just get the masses to accept the concept, as opposed to trying to divide up the property in some other way. It's not because you could say, well, I'm going to give everybody in the United States 330 millionth of the land, or whatever the case might be, but then the land's not going to be the same. So some people get more value than others and things like that. So there's no way you can really divide it up that way, and I'm not sure it would make sense. I don't think that the starting ownership of property is significant in the sense of there's a theorem by Ron Coase called the Coase theorem, which discusses that property will end up in its most valuable hands based just simply upon the fact that trade will move it that way. So, for example, if we have a situation, say, where the Koch brothers take over a massive amount of property, well, what are they going to do with them? I mean, it's possible that if they have millions of acres somewhere, they could just sit on it and not do anything. However, generally what people do is they try and gain from this. So if someone's got $1 million, a million acres of land, what they may want to do is build apartments on it, some type of Disneyland kind of thing. Just do something to gain even more value out of it. So it's not a case when people look at what the initial structure of property is. I'm not as concerned about that. If there was new land on the moon, I wouldn't care whether it was divided up amongst everybody on the planet, or whether two people, Jeff Bezos flies up there and Elon Musk, and sort of split the moon in half for their own initial ownership. That's not a big problem for me, because I understand that even if it's just a few people that own it, what would eventually happen out of that is a situation where the property would come into many, many uses. Now, so that said, given we currently have a property structure for most properties, except for where there might be some kind of dispute over a property, which is a very, very small amount, I say, well, let's just stick with what we have, because basically, how else are you going to develop this? There's no sort of given fairness to what property is, but I think what is most important is the recognition of a private property society, and the best way to get there with the people that currently own private property is to say, hey, if you've got a private property, you stick with what you have, versus trying to divide it up somehow and fool yourself into thinking that somehow you're going to make something that where there's some kind of equality. I just reject the idea of that type of equality existing.
Yeah. I mean, just to clarify the rightful ownership thing, though, because I understand from a point of view of drawing a line on the past, and just sort of say,
right.
Forget about what's happened, we move on from here, kind of thing. But what about moving forward? Is the issue of rightful ownership still something that doesn't come into play even moving forward? What I'm saying is like when you were talking about how things would get through trade, that's all well and good, but is there any distinction between that and how things get with regards to property ownership through what I would obviously distinguish as not rightful manners, like coercion and force and theft and what have you?
Right.
So, I understand the drawing a line from example, from the past, but moving forward, is there a distinction between rightfully owned property and what is stolen?
Well, so again, my perspective is the private property society theory would sort of start with this general acceptance of the current property ownership. And from there, what you're going to have, of course, you may have disputes. You may have someone who is a thief who tries to steal goods on a property or steal property itself. So then the question becomes, and now I reject any government at all. My foundational perspective is do whatever you want on your own property and no one can bother you. So how do you get to a situation from there to a situation where you have protection against someone encroaching on your property, coming on your property and steal things and all that sort of thing if you don't have a government? And my view there is that what you would have is you would say if it was a small tribe and you have something and you sort of have this view that you will agree with everyone to leave things alone on each other's property, but you know there might be some crazy guy. This is a tribe of 100 people, and there might be some crazy guy who's is not going to follow that. So what you would do is you would hire the biggest and toughest guy in the private property society sector as your protector, and as opposed to a government police. And you would say to your protector, I'll give you X amount, and he goes around to everybody else and say, I'll protect you from the crazy guy. So basically what you have is a situation where you have that private sector kind of protection. And if for some reason you don't like the biggest guy, the second biggest guy, and you use that guy. So that you wouldn't have the situation what you have now, where there is a government, where there's a central power that makes the rules for everyone, whether you like them or not. You can get to choose who you want to protect you. Now, naturally, what you're going to want to do when you choose somebody to do this, you're going to want to choose someone that is powerful enough, that has police forces sort of everywhere. So if you travel, they're going to protect you there if you're a traveler. And that if the Koch brothers hire a private military, you're going to have a police force that will stand up against that. So the Koch brothers aren't likely to challenge you and things of that nature. But at the same time, if at any time you don't like that police force for any reason, and there's a competing police force, you can use them. Or you can just say, if you want and you're living in a cave in the mountains somewhere, the hell with protection. I'll protect myself. And so it gives you a type of protection that... This should shut off. Sorry, apologies.
That's okay.
This should... So it allows you options. You can still hire someone big and strong to protect your property, but you have options, and you don't have someone that's dictating rules to you. If you have certain, then we can go a little bit into punishment theory as to what you want to do if someone violates your private property. Now, so suppose it's some kind of property border dispute, and you hire one private property. So suppose both property owners hire the same private property firm to protect them. Now you might have a situation where you basically say, okay, well, when you initially sign up with the private property society, they may say, hey, look, we represent lots of people. We basically recognize the non-aggression principle, and if you come up against one of our other customers, we're going to take it to our courts, which work on these lines and have the best noble judges in the country, in the world, or section, area, region. And therefore you will have to abide by that. So what happens is if you both have the same property owner, it would go through different stages of decision. Maybe a court, maybe a judge beyond that, maybe there's a jury, but it's something that you agree to in advance when hiring the private property company, recognizing that you might come up against one of their customers. And if you don't come up against one of their customers and it's another large customer, your private property society at the initial meeting might say, hey, look, the way we resolve things when it comes up against another major property owner that we recognize and respect is that we we will agree on which court to use, what judges to use, etc. So you basically have a situation where you're resolving things mostly peacefully. Now, if there's one crazy nut job out there, then your police force can take care of them for that. But when it's sort of a general problem within society that needs to be solved, and both sides have respectable protection for these things, the disputes would go through the court system.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I understand, like, from a practical point of view, with regards to these ideas on, this is how you could go about protecting yourself from this, and this is how you go about protecting yourself from that. But just to sort of, make sure I'm sort of crystal clear on this, there's no sort of, I suppose I'm trying to nail down what the rules are, if there are any really, with regards to this theory, because it's like I say, that's why I wanted to clarify with regards to the issue of rightful ownership going forward. Understanding about drawing a line on the past, but going forward, because I understand what you're saying about what you could do and all the rest of it, but that is really a utilitarian explanation of what you can do in practice. But I'm still not hearing a distinction between, and maybe there isn't a distinction, this is I suppose what I want to clarify with you, between like I say, rightful ownership and not rightful ownership. It's all very well that, it could well be settled in the ways that you described, but what if there were other, what if things weren't settled in those ways? What if people weren't abiding by the non-aggression principle? There's nothing in your system that says that they need to, and I suppose, is there any distinction between ownership that's gained through conquest and what I would consider to be illegitimate means, would consider it theft and not their what they rightfully own? But in your system, would it just be whatever they manage to possess? Almost, is it might makes right?
Yeah. Well, first of all, with regard to the concept of utilitarianism, that argument comes from the idea that something will be good for everyone. My perspective is that I'm arguing that a private property society would be good from my own perspective. I can't say whether it will be good for everybody. Certainly for the King of Saudi Arabia, it will not be a good deal given what he can do now versus a private property society. So it's something that I would argue that most people would agree with, but it's not based upon the idea that I say it's going to be good for everybody. Utilitarian will say, well, this will be good for everybody or almost everybody, therefore we should have it. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying this will be good for me, and I also think it will be very good for many other people if they thought about it, but I'm not putting in their mind that it definitely is. I'm not making decisions for them and saying this is broad-based goodness for all. It probably is going to be for most people, not for everybody. And again, you keep on bringing up the rights part of it, and I just completely reject the rights part of it. Now, as far as might makes right, I would argue this is the opposite. This is a civilized way to approach things, because if we're talking about property that is already owned, it gives the person who is a smaller person who can sign up for a large police force, because I expect prices to be relatively low for this, because the larger the police force, the lower the price because of economies of scale and all. So the might makes right works when there's government, because government has might. You can't fight that. You can't have your own police force of equal size to take something in a court to battle them. Government is might makes right. Private property society is everybody gets a chance on their own property to do what they want and to hire anyone they want for protection. Now, as far as how new property comes about, and that's where this question would come up more, I don't hold a theory on how new property comes about. Again, the moon is the case. If Bezos and Musk get up there, fine. I semi tongue-in-cheek wrote on my blog why don't we just today look at the number of people on the planet and divide it up and give everybody a piece of the moon, and let's do it right now and declare everybody's got an equal amount of the moon. If everybody's in favor of equality and all this kind of stuff on private property, we can do that now, because I argue there is no method of designating new private property that is foolproof, and you can't argue doesn't hurt some people that another people. For example, if you use the Lockean idea of mixing land with labor, well, you're discriminating against little old ladies. So, there's no way she's going to be able to compete with a young kid. So why should a young kid get a larger property than a little old lady who may even be in a wheelchair? So, there's no equality, and I don't really care, because from the Coasian theorem, it'll work out. On current property, we go with whoever has it now, but on new property, I don't care who gets there first. It will develop value and rankings based upon who it's most important for.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, just to clarify, I didn't mean, when I meant sort of going forward, I didn't mean new property with regards to sort of virgin territory. I meant sort of going forward with regards to the existing property, but how it might exchange hands. Like, for example, what I'm saying is in your society, is there, moving forward, not what's happened in the past, but moving forward, is there any distinction between me buying your property but through a voluntary trade and me just taking it through force, and now I'm in possession of it and now it's my property? What I'm saying is there any principle that distinguishes between the two, or is it, because that's why it sounds like might makes right to me. I know what you're saying with regards to you're taking the monopoly the government have on the might makes right game. They basically won the might makes right game, and they're reaping those they're utilizing the monopoly they have on that. But what you're suggesting still sounds like might makes right, but just without the end goal that the government have already achieved. Everyone's sort of having a little bit more of a fair go at that, but it still seems the same game. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. Now again, my argument is the only way a private property society would emerge if just everybody sort of recognizes on a general level that the private property society is the way to go. If we have people that believe in government, if we have a bunch of thugs running around, whatever the case might be along those lines, private property society wouldn't work. That's why we don't have a private property society now, because most people do not buy into what I have written about here.
Sure,
and given I just wrote about it, I mean, it's going to be tough for the world to sort of actually be aware of it, and never mind buying into it, because it goes against almost all structures of society now. So if you've got a property, I would argue that the general idea, the general theme would be that you're able to maintain your property and people have to leave you alone on your property and with your property. Now, granted that is the case, but you're also going to have the outlier who may attempt to take that property from you. And in that case, that's where you would hire police to protect you in the same way you hire doctors to help you if you have an illness, the way you have a barber to cut your hair, the way you have a painter to paint your house. It's just another function that exists in the private property society to create the one-off outliers that are out there and deal with them. And it may be, you just put up a big enough fence, depending upon what your fear is of who is around you. And I don't really see that as might makes right. I really sort of almost see that as a defense against might, because the only person that could successfully take your property is someone that is somehow forcefully stronger than you are. So that's the kind of person you would want to stop. And in my kind of society, you could hire the police department that sort of protects you against that. And it also is a structure that prevents against a huge bad group coming at you. Like, again, suppose the Koch brothers decide to get their own military. I mean, it would be our military is incredibly expensive, and if you have most of the rest of the world not wanting one group to rule over everybody, to take everybody's property, it's much easier for that mass of people to pay for their own little plot of land to protect against that, which becomes a major force, than it would be for even a multi-billionaire to try and take that over. It really sort of tampers down on the might question. The government is the place where you don't have a chance. In a private property society, pretty much everybody has a chance. With the government, you don't.
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying. I guess what I was saying was more that I get that point, but the government has the monopoly on, the might makes right game. But even if you take that away, it still seems to me that you're left with might. I mean, like when you're talking about, you can defend yourself against people that are attempting to use the philosophy of might makes right to take from you, but you're only defending it with your own might. You know what I mean? It's not, there's no principle to say they shouldn't be doing it. It's only whether you have the might or you can acquire the might, whether it's hiring police or whatever it is. By might I mean, basically result that can count for like resources and wealth to, obviously, recruit military style defence if need be and what have you. So what I'm saying, I suppose that's where I'm coming from the might. I suppose I just want to have a clarification I want to make, like just with regards to because I do understand what you're saying about obviously not everyone's going to buy into an ideology. I mean, even what I'm presenting with the Nations of Sanity, I want to establish the non-aggression principle as the law, as the terms of peace between all people. That doesn't mean I expect everybody to go along with that, and obviously there are going to be people that want to violate that. But what I'm saying is, and this is where I want you to correct me if I'm wrong, because I want to, I don't want to strawman you in any way. I want to make sure I'm understanding this properly. But in your society, let's say, for example, hypothetically, even if everybody was in agreement with, if everybody was in agreement with the whole Napper's Law thing, then I realise that's not going to happen. But if everyone was in agreement, then no one would violate the NAP. So there'd be no robbery, there'd be no rape, there'd be no murder, because everyone would abide that rule. What I'm saying is in in this property society, even if everybody was on board with that, there's nothing to say there wouldn't be theft, there wouldn't be robbery, there wouldn't be rape, because there's nothing in there that says that there's anything wrong with any of that. I'm not saying it endorses it either, and I'm not saying that obviously you're doing that. I'm just saying that there doesn't, because of this rejection of rights, it seems to me that it opens up the door for saying that morality is all subjective, which is, essentially moral relativism. And then and I suppose that's where I link it back to the might makes right thing, because then for me, the only consistent philosophy you can lay down if you accept the premise that there is no morality is, well, in that case, then might makes right. Whatever people can manage to make happen is how it should be. And if I can hire a bigger army than you and take your property, then that's how it is. And there's nothing, like I say, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't want to be misrepresenting you anywhere, I just want to try and understand it better. Even if everybody in society agreed with what with your thing, would that necessarily mean that they couldn't rob each other and what have you?
Yeah, no, that's a very, very good question. And I get the moral relative question thrown up to me frequently. And I don't argue there's moral relativism. My private society theory is basically silent on morality. I happen to have very strict moral views for myself and believe that they're the ones that should apply to everyone. The only thing private property society does is say, look, if your moral rules are different than mine, you can do whatever you want on your property. If you're a Muslim, if you're a Catholic, Episcopalian, whatever, a Jewish, whatever you are, do whatever on your property, and I don't care. I'm not attempting to impose my morality on you. It's not moral relativism. It's recognition that different people hold different views as to what the morality is, and they can do whatever they want as far as attempting to convert people to their morality. But it's a theory that is basically silent on which one is correct. It's not at all saying that morality is relative. It's not saying that at all. It's saying this is what my morality, what my beliefs are. You may have other very hardcore beliefs. You can practice them on your property. You may be a moral relativist. You can practice that on your property. So it's not making a statement about morality at all. Now, go ahead.
Oh, well, I was going to say, so, I mean, it sounds like morality is just, it's basically ignoring morality. So it's not,
no,
it's
not
for moral relativism, even if it's not actively endorsing it. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, but it's allowing for hardcore morality. It's allowing for Islamic law. It's allowing for Jewish law. It's allowing for Christian law, recognizing that different people have different beliefs. And what my private property, the subtitle is, it's anarchism for the civilized person. So what I'm trying to do is reject violence and reject might versus right, where the group that has the majority is militarily strongest imposes their views of the world on everybody else. I'm rejecting that. What I'm basically saying is, look, the fundamentals here are, let's get along by each recognizing you can do whatever you want on your own private property and go for it from there. Yeah, I recognize the Muslims have specific rules and practices and a view of morality. I recognize Catholics have something different, and Jews may have something a bit different from that, and they should all go about it. It's not addressing the topic of which one is right, which one is correct, or if they're all wrong. It's just simply saying, I recognize there are differences in moral views, and we can get along as a civilized society if we start from the fundamental of private property society.
Right. Okay. When you say about people, can practice what they want on their property, is that you talking from your own personal, position, or talking about what this ideology is saying? Because, I mean, just to give you an example before you answer that of what I'm saying, just to give you an example with regards to what I'm promoting here, like the Napper's law doesn't cover all of my personal morality. I argue that the NAP represents an objective standard of morality, but I have all my subjective standards of morality that go above that. So just to give you an example, the NAP doesn't outlaw racism. It's not a violation of the non-aggression principle to be racist, but I personally think it's immoral. So I personally wouldn't associate with somebody like that, but I recognise that they're not committing a crime simply by being racist alone. So what I'm saying is that would be, when I talk about how I don't think that, don't think people should be judged by their skin colour, I'm talking about me, that's my personal values. But that's not what the ideology, that's not what the the Nations of Sanity is about. The Nations of Sanity makes no comment about whether racism is right or wrong. The Nations of Sanity just says the non-aggression principle defines what's a crime and what's not a crime, and that doesn't cover all right and wrong. It just defines what's an actual crime and what's an initiation of force and what have you. So when you were talking about that with regards to people can do what they want on their property, is that you speaking for your own personal preference, like me with the racism thing, or is it you talking about what this private property society would be laying down as a foundation of defining it?
Yeah. So basically, what I'm saying by that is, people should be able to do whatever they want on their private property. I certainly, there are lots of practices that would go on. I mean, I'm basically a very, very conservative guy. Tattoos don't work. I'm not doing many things out of there that are outside of the very, very conservative perspective of society right now. You bring up racism. I happen to think racism is goofy. I mean, but I don't care if someone doesn't want to allow people on their property for whatever reason. I don't care. I think it might be goofy. They might be losing valuable interactions with people if they stop that. But if they don't want blacks or Indians or whatever on their property, I don't really care. And but there's nothing in private property society that says you must reject this group or you must reject it. It's basically saying do whatever you want on your property.
But does it say that you must respect people's right to do whatever they want on their property?
It does not. It does not. Well, respect in the sense that you allow anybody to do whatever they want on their property. But and so you're never interfering with someone on their property unless they've interfered with your property. And then you can sort of go after them, kind of thing. But if they're on their property, whatever they do there, if they're, worshiping bonfires, whatever the hell they're doing,
Yeah, no, I mean, I understand. I mean, to be honest, that's the same if the NAP was the law as well in regards to what I'm advocating.
Yeah, it's very, and as far as my personal private property and the types of people I would want to live around, what I really expect happening in such a private property society is people would choose the way they choose now to live. If they have children of school age, they tend to try and live somewhere where there are good schools, or a lot of people who are concerned about their physical protection would want to live in an area that's safe. You would tend to want to live in a private property society where you have a private property amongst people that are similar to you. So I'm basically believe in the non-aggression theorem. That's how I would basically operate my property. So I would want to be around people that also respect the non-aggression principle, and so on, and really stay away from the real yahoos. The way now we stay away from yahoos that bad parts of town.
Sure, yeah, I understand that, and but for you, the non-aggression principle would just be like your personal morality rather than something that's part of this society that you're advocating.
Yeah, well, I see the morality as maybe a little bit different than the non-aggression principle itself. I just see the non-aggression principle as the type that would benefit me best. I mean, if I'm not messing with people, they're going to know I'm not messing with them. So they're more apt to interact, exchange, do whatever. I think it's best to have an open view, protect yourself against the wackos, but have an open view with regard to everybody else. Let them do what they want so they understand I'm not a threat, and they'll be willing to exchange with me, and do it because of that reason.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I mean, like I say, and just to sort of give you a little bit of insight into where I'm coming from, obviously, with the Nations of Sanity thing, because I do understand why people sort of view morality as a completely subjective thing.
Now again, I don't necessarily view it as subjective. Okay. I just recognize that other people have different views. They, from my perspective, they're probably wrong, but I don't care. I'm going to allow them to practice. If they want to practice witchcraft, I shouldn't say with their own people. If their own people agree to, voodoo or whatever the case might be, okay. I don't care. I think that's wrong. I think it's a waste of time reading a horoscope. If I go to a Chinese restaurant and they give me a cookie, fortune cookie, I don't open it. I believe I make my own fortune. It's not in the cookie. So basically, I'm saying, go do whatever you want. Open a fortune cookie, read your horoscope, practice witchcraft, practice voodoo, do whatever the hell you want. I don't care. I think you're wrong, but I'm not going to mess with you. Sure. This is a non-mess.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, I mean, the problem for me still is, though, that you are talking about yourself personally, your own personal ideals and moralities and what have you, and it's like, I suppose it's like with going back to the question I said before about, if everybody did actually accept this private property society, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're all going to be like you and have the same, that many of them might still violate the NAP, for example, I suppose is the thing I'm getting at. I mean, what I'm saying is like, although, this is like total thought experiment, I realise this isn't ever going to happen in the real world, same as it won't happen in my society.
Not anytime soon.
There's always going to be some people, no matter how, there's always going to be some people that will fight against anything. And, even in my society, there'll be people that won't agree with the non-aggression principle and will violate it. But just as a thought experiment, if everybody did go along with the non-aggression principle, then there would be no theft, there'd be no rape, there'd be no murder, there'd be no assault, because all of those things are violations of the non-aggression principle. Now, what I'm saying is in your society, even if everybody went along with the program, there's nothing in the program to say they can't do all of those things. Or correct me if I'm wrong. You know, like I suppose that's why again, when I step back from it, it doesn't look like moral relativism when I'm looking in it close. But when I sort of step back at that realization, that's when it starts looking like moral relativism. Because although I understand you as a person wouldn't endorse these things, and the reason why you're obviously in placing this society is because you believe this is the best way to avoid those sort of things. But what I'm saying is there's nothing written into the definition of what you're advocating that says that rape's wrong, that murder's wrong, that theft's wrong, that even defines rightful ownership, as far as I can tell. Again, correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, even the thing what you said about everyone can do what they want on their own property, that's something that you believe, but is that something that everybody that accepts this philosophy would also be having to abide by and believe?
Yeah. Okay. So, first of all, if rape would be illegal, murder, so on and so forth on my property. And I would think that it would be illegal on most properties. I mean, you don't really want to walk around.
I would hope.
Yeah. I mean, you know, there's parts of, you know, I'm in San Francisco.
It doesn't have to be, is my point, according to your system.
I don't want to mess with other people. There are yahoos. You know, I'm in the city of San Francisco here. I can go a few blocks, and there are yahoos that are, you know, shooting, stealing. Who the hell? You can get into a fight very easily in this city and many other cities. If there, my philosophy for society is not trying to change the whole society to accept what I want. It's not about. I mean, it would be great if they did. I don't mind missionary work going into what our area is called the Tenderloin. I do not mind them doing that. I don't mind people practicing sort of a conversion into a specific type of moral perspective. I'm just saying I'm trying to understand how it's best to get along in a society where all this madness does go along. How do we get along without a government that is forcing us in a specific direction, or a morality that is forcing us in a specific direction? I don't want the Muslims to tell me what to do. I don't want Catholics, really. I'm born Catholic. I don't want them to tell me what to do. I don't want Jews telling me what to do. You know, I want to be able to just practice what my moral thinking is on my land and not worry about anybody else. So if any, it's a very non-confrontational way of living. It's really a civilized way to live. It's recognizing that there are differences between people for whatever reason, and that the best way to do it, instead of trying to force everybody to adopt our ways, it sort of accepts that there are other ways, and you would tend to move into a section of the world where people would recognize and adopt your thinking, or you're moving into an area where that thinking already exists, and so I just think it limits strife, and you know, I understand what you're saying by the might makes right, because when it comes down to it, you know, the lion is king in a way of the jungle, okay, and man on earth, you still get powerful people. You have kings and generals and presidents who can direct many men to march and kill for many reasons. And what I'm trying to do is trying to really tone that down as much as possible by eliminating the kings, the presidents, and the generals. Not to say that you can't, you know, you're not going to have protection for your property, that it's not necessary, but it's really toned down to the degree where most people recognize it really doesn't make sense to have these kings and generals and presidents who are making war. We're in a situation where the only boundaries are private property and protection for that private property, which tones down the might versus right. Really what I imagine would come out of that is a private property society might, in the sense that there would be very, very little in terms of violation. You wouldn't eliminate it completely, as you say, even in your perspective of the non-aggression theory. You're not going to get everyone to accept it. But I would say it tones it down by leaps and bounds.
Yeah, I mean, I do understand the sort of the practical approach that you're taking to it, and it is all. I mean, yeah, like, and your attempt to sort of tone things down. I suppose, like with regards to when you said about you've got your morality, but you don't want to impose morality on others. I mean, I suppose this is and this is where obviously the reason why I think the non-aggression principle is the way to go with regards to what I advocate is because,
I would live in your society. You sound like a great society. I would live in your society, but go ahead. Mine is very, very tough to get adopted across the world, even though it's allowing everybody to do what they want. Yours makes it even more difficult because you're sort of blocking people who, if they don't want to accept the non-aggression principle, you don't give them a choice. So yours is even more difficult. But I would live in if you could do it, I'd live there.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that. But what I suppose what I'm saying is the because it is about, I suppose, the way I approach it, and obviously this is different because you've looked at it from a practical sense first, and the principle kind of afterwards, or even perhaps not at all in many cases.
Oh no!
Go on.
I looked at the principles as lacking. I look at the utilitarian is faulty, the rights is faulty, and therefore, what do I have? What do I have that I can work with as a principle? And I recognize there are individuals, and they all have their own subjective views. So that's kind of a fundamental. It's really not practical in the sense it doesn't have a theoretical foundation. It has a theoretical foundation. Hayek said that in economics, the greatest advances were moving in the direction of subjectivism. And subjectivism is recognizing individual choices. So this is sort of advancing it a little bit different way, but this is sort of advancing it into political theory, saying, okay, what's wrong with natural rights theory and utilitarianism? It's trying to develop a theory for everyone in an aggregate sense that everyone will like this because of this or that, and I don't find the foundation for that. So how do I what kind of operating principle can I find that will recognize the way the world really is, and knowing that Hayek advanced this idea that subjectivism was at the forefront of advancing economics, I see it applies very, very well in terms of society and political theory. And that's recognizing, well, everybody has their own choices, their own desires, and therefore, how can I develop a society based around that principle? So it's not really looking at it practically. It's sort of, when you get the right principle, it aligns itself with practicality. And that's what's going on here. The principle is everyone sort of has their own subjective views. Therefore, how can I build a society if everybody has their own subjective views? So that's a principle.
Yeah, I mean, it is. But the problem is that principle sounds an awful lot like moral relativism, because it's kind of saying, well, it's saying everyone's got their own.
But it's not. It's really not. Because again, because I recognize that everybody has their own views. They can be right or wrong. Again, a fortune cookie is not going to tell anybody their fortune. I don't believe in palm readers. I don't believe in most moral views that are out there. I'm just allowing them to exist. It's not moral relativism. I'm not forcing my morality on the rest of the world, because I see that as the best way for a civil society to exist.
Well, even if it's not actively moral relativism, it's at the very least allowing for it. Would you sort of accept that?
or it's allowing for hardcore morality where moral relativism is not allowed on certain properties.
Sure, but it's allowing for either one, and it's not making any kind of statement over which one.
Yeah, it's not. It's a very civilized society, recognizing that people have different views, and there is no reason to go about attacking them because it just makes things worse.
Sure, yeah, but the problem is and again, this is why, sorry to keep using the same term of moral relativism, but this is why it sounds like it to me, just to...
yeah, but it's not. It's not.
Yeah, okay. I mean, well, basically, it's just like... I mean, what separates... I mean, just to perhaps explain it better, if I just sort of go through my sort of position with regards to...
Sure.
Because I do reject the idea that all morality is subjective. I know you're not saying that that's what the assertion that you're making. But
right.
The problem is your philosophy does allow for that. You know, it's like, it's all very well saying that, and I understand, and it would be our preference that people would, that in your society, the people who can do what they want on their own property would, you know, be decent people and wouldn't be doing terrible
right.
things on their property. But I suppose obviously the difference is in my society, but in what I'm advocating, if people were stepping over the line of actually, you know, violating the non-aggression principle, if they were actually raping or murdering or doing any of those things, even on their own property, then not only are they not allowed to do that, but I would have every right to, whether it's a wise decision or not, whether I have the capability or not is another issue, but I would have the right to. That's what my thing's saying. I would have the right to stop them. So I know it sounds like, oh, well, you're imposing on people, but the only thing you're imposing is a principle that prohibits you from aggressing against other people's equal right to freedom that you want for yourself. And the reason why I sort of insist that this is an objective standard of morality is because no matter who you are, every violation of the non-aggression principle is defined by the lack of consent. So it doesn't matter who you are. It's not a matter of perspective. Nobody would want to be the victim of a rape. By definition, they wouldn't want to be, because if they wanted it, it wouldn't be rape. You know, obviously these things are defined by the lack of consent from the victim. Right. Same with theft, same with murder, same with all violations of the non-aggression principle. That is what defines the non-aggression principle, essentially. So what I'm saying is you can apply a consistent principle there. I don't want to be robbed, so it's a logical progression that it is moral. That it would be immoral for me to rob somebody else, because I don't want it happening to me. So I recognise the immorality because, and like I say, it's not a subjective thing, because I might not want to smoke cannabis and someone else might want to, but that's a preference. Some people might want to, some people might not want to. Some people might think it's wrong, some people might not think it's wrong. But there's no objective standard for saying that it's a crime, because you can't apply it universally, but I can apply a prohibition to rape universally, because even if there are some people that would want to violate that law and rape somebody else, no one wants to be the victim of rape. They can't be by definition, as I say, because that's how it's defined.
Well, let's set aside the rape thing for a second and just talk about a robbery, okay? Suppose there's a billionaire who has on the edge of his property that's near a road or something a fruit market, okay? And there's someone that is hungry and has no food to eat, has nowhere to get it, and just really needs something to be able to survive until tomorrow. And he steals an apple, okay? Now, there are going to be some people that are going to argue that he has a right to do that, okay? Now, I'm not saying that. Well, what I'm saying is there will be some people that will say that. So it seems that you would argue that is a violation, in that that person needs to be punished somehow or something like that. Okay, so you're basically arguing something that not everybody's going to agree with. I mean, there's a lot of people that are not going to agree with you on that. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit.
So you're basically, you're basically saying, look, this guy has no right to live. It's really in one way what you're saying, okay? And I can understand your argument there on the non-aggression principle. If there's a billionaire there and he's got his fruit cart and he doesn't want an apple stolen, then from your perspective, he has no quote unquote right to not protect himself from that. But there's going to be a lot of people, and so what's going to happen is you're going to get a lot of people that are going to say yours is a very, very harsh view of how you want.
Just the problem with that is because it's a little bit, perhaps not exactly, but it's very close to the kind of lifeboat situation, which is often brought up, like theft is wrong, but is it wrong to steal a loaf of bread to feed your starving family kind of thing? Right. So I understand that, but what I would say to that is, whether or not I thought it was wrong, and I know I wouldn't think it would be wrong in that situation, even though it probably is technically a violation.
Yeah, but so your non-aggression principle then is not a hardcore non-aggression principle.
If I could just sort of explain
because
further. If I could just sort of just elaborate quickly, because what I'm saying is there might be situations where I would violate the non-aggression principle myself if I was pushed to it, but what I'm saying is I would still recognise it a crime. Now, what I'm saying is it is a crime to rob somebody, but the fact that you can create a scenario where my sympathies would actually think, okay, well, actually, I would accept that crime because the consequences are worse and what have you, or the situation was dire enough. And certainly in what they call the lifeboat situation, where it's actually a matter of life and death, then you actually take away the criminal intent, you lose the mens rea, and if that's not an argument for actually declaring it no longer a violation of the non-aggression principle, it's certainly an argument for bringing it down to such a low level. Because that's the other thing that's obviously worth remembering, that not all violations of the non-aggression principle are equal. Petty theft isn't the same as murder, and all sorts of other things are put into account. So if you're in a situation where, it's wrong to take someone's property, it would be wrong to trespass. Let's put this, here's a good example just to sort of perhaps explain it further. It's wrong to trespass on someone's property, but that's a very low-level violation of the non-aggression principle. Now, if somebody was drowning in someone's swimming pool, and the only way to save their life would be to invade their trespass and save them, I would actually argue that that's not a violation of the non-aggression principle at all, because it would be reasonable to assume that the homeowner would give you permission retrospectively, but it's simply not possible for you to obtain permission in time to acquire it before you trespass, because it's an emergency situation. There's no criminal intent, and the harm you would be allowing far exceeds the harm that you're causing in that situation. Now, that situation is not exactly the same as the example you gave, but I just wanted to lay that out just to show that there are instances where the circumstances would negate it being a violation of the non-aggression principle.
Right. So in other words, you're basically saying that your view of the non-aggression principle is practical versus a hard principle. See, my private property is much more hardcore. Yeah, mine is very, very easy for anybody to understand. On your property, you can do whatever you want. On anybody else's property, they make the rules. That's hard, set in cement, does not change. With yours, you're sort of leaving the door open. So it then becomes a question of, well, how far do we open the door? When do we open it? When do we not open it? It's not hard and concrete.
Okay, well, just again, because I don't think what I'm saying is a practical thing. I think it is still hard principle. But just to elaborate further, there was 3 examples I went through when I spoke to Walter Block and Mike Wedderstein before with regards to these kind of scenarios. Because the problem with it is it's dealing with the minutiae, that kind of edge of the line with regards to what is and isn't a violation of the non-aggression principle. So reasonable people who understand the principle might disagree on these certain things, but we basically laid out.
Well, that's the problem.
Sorry,
it's the problem because it's not a hardcore thing where you're leaving doors open. Reasonable people can take different views, and then how do you resolve that? Mine is very, very simple.
I think
whatever you do, mine is just very simple. Whatever you do on your property it's up to you, and the rules are set by the individual on their
I
property.
understand that, and I mean, I suppose my critique is perhaps it's too simple and it's leaving out some important things that are needed going forward, which is obviously what I'm making the case for with regards to what the non-aggression principle.
Simplicity is not a danger. Often there's greatness in simplicity. My background is more in economics and finance, and I was once explaining to a gentleman the Austrian business cycle theory just before the crash, and I told him why I expected a crash, and he told me the Austrian business cycle theory was too simple. Well, simplicity predicted the crash. He has some kind of complex models which were way off, to say the least. Nothing wrong with simplicity, but go ahead.
I mean, I suppose what I was saying is I do reject the assertion that the principle isn't hard and fast, just because there are areas where reasonable people might disagree because you're dealing with the minutiae, but that doesn't mean there's not an objective answer. And just to illustrate what I mean, I just want to go through three quick examples. So there's three kind of hypotheticals that were laid out, and it was like, which one's a violation of the non-aggression principle and which one's not? And it was, one of the scenarios was somebody's about to get hit by a bus, and you basically run and push him out of the way. He might hurt himself, but you're saving his life because he's about to get hit by a bus. The other scenario was someone was about to jump off a bridge and kill themselves. You know that's what they want to do. They say that's what they want to do. You won't let them. You kind of kidnap them for a few days and try to talk them out of it, or what have you. You don't do it indefinitely, but you do it for like a day or two or something. You try to stop them, and you violate their will. And then the other one was, like I say, the scenario I gave you with regards to the trespassing to save someone drowning in a swimming pool. Now, one of those was a violation of the non-aggression principle, and that is the kidnapping the person to stop them committing suicide. Even though it's a very low level one, there's a lot of good intent there. You're trying to do it for the best. They might even retrospectively absolve you of the violation by giving you permission retrospectively, but at the time you're violating their will, so you are violating the non-aggression principle. As much as it's harsh to judge you in that way and your good intentions and what have you, that is a violation of the non-aggression principle. Pushing someone out of the way who's about to get hit by a bus is not a violation of the non-aggression principle, even though you didn't act with their permission, because you literally didn't have time to get their permission, and it would be a reasonable assumption that they would give you permission, because as far as you don't know that they've purposely stood in front of that truck. As far as you know, they're going to get killed. They don't want to be killed, and you're doing something they would want you to do. It would be a reasonable assumption. So that's definitely not a violation of the non-aggression principle. Now, the incident with trespassing on the thingy to save a person's life, even though I still say that's not a violation of the non-aggression principle, I can understand why some people might take the view that it's a little bit like the kidnapping the suicidal person in regards to it being a violation, but a very low-level one that they personally forgive and what have you. But I would say it's still not a violation of the non-aggression principle. But the reason why there's this difficulty in people determining that is because you've got two opposing factors. You've got the trespassing issue, which on its own would be a violation of the non-aggression principle. But then you've got, like I say, the lifeboat situation of saving a life, of the reasonable assumption, like with the pushing the person out of the way of the truck, that permission will be given retrospectively, not just by the person drowning in the pool, who you may or may not know to be the homeowner. You might make that assumption, but even if you knew that it wasn't the homeowner, you could still make the reasonable assumption that the homeowner would have given you permission retrospectively. So there are some reasons. I mean, again, it's like things with like abortion and stuff like that. People can be in agreement on the non-aggression principle, but might take slightly different views on the abortion issue, because they might argue over at what point that life becomes, a life deserving of the rights that the non-aggression principle provides. So the principle itself is objective, but I would agree that without making the whole principle subjective, because I do still think that the principle itself is objective and black and white, but there are some fuzzy edges, and it doesn't mean that there's not an objective line. It just means that perhaps we haven't managed to find the sophistication intellectually to really draw those precise lines in that, when you're sort of really zooming into a real microscopic and precise detail and dealing with real absurd examples that have a little bit of a quality of both. Like, for example, to give you, like with a conflict with regards to abortion, the conflict is you've got, normally it wouldn't be right to, in accordance with non-aggression principle, it wouldn't be right to violate someone's right to do what they want to do with their own body. But obviously in the case of the abortion, the counterexample is, yes, but there's another life in that body, And, you know, if you take the view that that life is worthy of protecting by the non-aggression principle, then you're killing it. And do you see what I mean? So there are areas where two things clash.
But see, here's the problem. See, but what you're sort of creating a situations where it's really unclear. And in the private property society, those kinds of things could be made clear very easily. Let's take a plane where someone has a medical emergency, okay? A heart attack or whatever it might be, and the stewardess gets on or the pilot gets on and says, you know, is there a doctor in the house? Now, given that we're not clear on the rules and someone could be sued for working on someone who does not want to be worked on, often a doctor will not identify himself as a doctor, even though he could save the person, because there have been cases where doctors have been sued for interfering when they shouldn't have and done something. Now, in a private property society, where something like that could come up, you could very easily have policies by the airlines that say, you know, by using our airline service, you agree to the fact that if it appears to the flight personnel that you are experiencing a medical emergency, we will attempt to identify medical people on the plane, and you will not allow you will not be allowed to sue those people if they perform some kind of emergency service on you. Or you could have another plane that says, we recognize that you may not want emergency personnel to work on you if you have a medical emergency. Therefore, check this box.
Sorry, but you can have those things in the NAP society as well. There's nothing. I mean, the NAP allows people to add. The NAP's just laying down the law, but part of that law allows people to make voluntary contracts with each other where they set all sorts of other rules and agreements and what have you. So what you just described could also exist under the NAP as well. So even if the NAP doesn't lay it down as law, people can still voluntarily associate in the way that you describe. It doesn't prohibit what you're talking about in any way, shape or form. The problem is what you're talking about. Yes, that could happen in your society, but the opposite could happen as well. What I'm saying is there's nothing to say that could happen, or there's nothing to say that someone else who, as you fly over their property, doesn't just decide to blow you out of the sky because you've, do you see what I'm saying? What I'm saying is there's no rule to say this is right and this is wrong, outside of you do what you want on your own property. And I'm still not 100% sure if the tenet that you can do what you want on your own property is actually written into this ideology or this society system, or whether it's your personal preference. Does that make sense?
No.
Fair enough.
Yeah. That's the short answer. You want to add that? What I'm basically saying is that the fundamental precept of the private property society is you are allowed to do whatever you want on your property. It does not dictate that you cannot set up rules on your property in any way to limit any kind of actions, okay, and or to not limit. I mean, whatever you want on your property goes, or if you want to limit it in any way, you can limit it in any way. So it just sort of downgrades the number of conflicts you're going to have. Okay, now, just quickly getting back to the plane situation. What we're talking about there is sort of a situation now where there's government involved, and government sort of sets the rules as opposed to how they might evolve over a private property society. My guess is that most people, if they're facing an emergency, would want medical service for them. But now the way the rules are laid out, it's dangerous in a lot of situations for physicians to identify themselves as such on a plane. So
and that's something you're concerned about in a NAP society.
No. My point is that if you're going to have a fully NAP society, okay, then it really almost becomes a private property society there, because the rules are really set by the private property owner. And you're sort of creating a situation where somehow the private property owner forgot to set the rules.
Well, it's basically it's setting a set of rules above that. So it's like it does say that people can set whatever rules they want on their own property, but to a point. Just like it says people can do what they want in their general life and how they live their life, but to a point. And that point is the non-aggression principle, and that line that you can't cross is defined by the non-aggression principle.
But see, my point is that it doesn't really answer, the NAP doesn't answer the question of the emergency on a plane cannot be resolved by the NAP. It has to really go down to the private property, because the plane owner can decide how he wants medical situations to be handled on his plane and let the passengers know. Whereas the NAP itself cannot solve that.
And that is actually a fair point, because I understand what you're saying. The NAP doesn't provide that level of clarity, at least not as a principle on its own. Simply understanding that principle, as we've already discussed, doesn't necessarily mean everyone's going to agree on when you get down to sort of these minutiae areas where there's a potential kind of grey area or something like that. So that is a fair point. I mean, but the two things I would sort of clarify. One, like I say, the defence against that your system allows with regards to people being able to set other rules that do cover these eventualities and agreements in advance and what have you, that do allow doctors to act in these situations and what have you, those things that can be put in place in your society can be put in place equally easily in the NAP society. There's no difference there, but what the difference is sorry.
Yeah, because you're going more towards a private property society setting the rule there. It's not the NAP, it's the private property society.
The fundamental difference is in the NAP society, the NAP is, I mean, it's basically, if you can imagine, I don't know if you can actually see me, but if you can imagine kind of like, I'm saying that the NAP is at the top as the law. So no one's allowed to violate.
Right.
But then underneath that, what the NAP allows people to do is to enter into agreements where they can set more detailed rules down to their own preferences as part of voluntary collectives or part of associations, the whole voluntary association thing.
Right.
So basically people can do exactly what you're describing as long as they don't violate the NAP. The NAP is like an oversight, an overriding law that sort of sits above everything else that we do. It says you can make whatever rules you want on your property, just as you can do what you want in your own life, but you can't violate the NAP. Now, with regards to the plane incident and why it applies to that, is what I'm saying is in the plane incident, one, you can do what you can do in your private property society where people can still set their other agreements, so there isn't a violation of the NAP because everyone's agreed to these extra rules in advance. You see what I'm saying? Me and you can enter in contract where we agree to lots of different rules that have got nothing to do with the NAP, as long as we're not violating the NAP, but if it's part of an agreement, we probably won't be. So, so that's one thing I wanted to sort of clarify, that you're not losing that option in a NAP society. That's basically something that both our societies are offering as a solution. But the other thing, one fair point that I do think you did make, and this is an actual complaint I have with other anarchists who are proponents of the non-aggression principle, is you do need to deal with these fuzzy edges. Because if you're in a situation where you haven't made these prior agreements that we were talking about that could solve the plane incident, and you did have to rely on the only other rule book you had, which was the NAP's law, and you were in one of these situations where, even a reasonable understanding of the NAP might leave people arguing over, where you're drawing the line in a certain incident. And that's precisely why, the Nations of Sanity's proposal of establishing the NAP as law doesn't just say, well, let's all agree to have the NAP as law. It actually has a 3-part agreement. And just to very briefly run that down for you, the 3-part agreement is it's not just 3 parts for the fun of it. They're very important. And the first part is just the basic agreement to establish the NAP as law. And part 2 is to draw the lines in the sand, to add this extra definition so people know where they stand moving forward. So there is actually something that people can reference to and say, no, this is where the line is drawn. The NAP, like I say, when everyone agrees to the NAP, it kind of makes most things clear. But there are certain areas when you can get into this real minutiae where it might be unclear. So that's why we propose sort of drawing what, like I say, they're called the lines in the sand. And that's part 2 of the agreement. And then part 3 is agreeing rightful ownership. And the point of that format of the agreement, in many ways, it shouldn't need to be 3 parts. It should just need to be 1 part, agreeing to have the NAP as law, and that should be all the agreement requires. But because simply agreeing to the principle alone doesn't necessarily add that extra clarity, which you rightly pointed out could be a problem if you don't have it, so I'm glad you brought that up, because that is actually a problem with a lot of proponents of the non-aggression principle and a lot of models that people present for how to move forward with a free society. I do actually agree with you that that's a problem, but that is specifically why we've drawn up this specific agreement, and part 2 deals with that very issue. It says, because of the problem you mentioned of where there could be this fuzzy edges of where people don't actually know exactly what the NAP's saying in this particular scenario, we need to draw these lines in advance. And it won't have to be just to give you another very brief example, but it's like one of the examples I use is age of consent, for example. And like the NAP says that an adult has full rights to full self-ownership, but it also says that a child is dependent on its parents, and they can't consent to things like drugs and sex and illegal contracts because they don't possess the understanding to consent and what have you. But what the NAP doesn't do is tell you exactly with precise certainty when a child becomes an adult. So reasonable people can disagree, and different people might want to form different societies where they have a specific age which meets their personal preference, but we still need to draw a line that applies universally that says, okay, at this point, definitely a child, definitely can't consent to this, and moving forward. Some areas you don't need to draw that line. Sometimes it is black and white, but there are certain areas where, even though and again, I'm not saying that the principle is subjective, I still think the principle was black and white, but like I say, with abortion, with age of consent, with other things like that, with pollution. Again, pollution can be a violation of the non-aggression principle, but only if it's harmful. And if it's not, then it's not. So that's the defining, but where you draw that line precisely, there needs to be some level. So there is a kind of glimmer of subjectivity that can creep into certain aspects, but as a whole, I think the principle is pretty objective.
Yes, I don't think we're that far apart in our perspective. My perspective is simply, you're trying to draw these lines in the sand, and the question becomes, well, how do you draw these lines in the sand? I mean, is it by popular vote? What debate? I mean, how do we get to these lines? Mine is simple. Everybody draws their own lines on their own property, and it solves the problem.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. I mean, like I say, one of the reasons why I had this, I commend you for your efforts in coming up with solutions, just as I'm trying to come up with solutions. And because I knew that there are areas, obviously, where, we're on the same page over things, but then there's obviously some very obvious differences as well, where, in the non-aggression principle, obviously, is the main difference, because that's kind of like the defining part of what the Nations of Sanity is saying, that, we need to define a free society by the non-aggression principle. We're saying that the non-aggression principle basically defines crime, so it should be the law. Not just rules that some people accept and some people don't, and we agree to, that subjectivity. We're saying, no, when it comes to the non-aggression principle, it's not subjective. It's an objective standard of what is and isn't a initiation of force. And just one more thing I just want to say about it with regards to the objective thing is, because one of the beauties, I think, one of my selling points, I suppose you could say, with regards to having the NAP as the law, and one of the things that keeps the principle consistent and objective, is by definition, enforcing the Napper's law, by definition, doesn't require ruling people, and it doesn't require the initiation of force. I mean, obviously, the initiation of force is itself a violation of the non-aggression principle. But the point is enforcing the Napper's law would be, by definition, an act of defence, because all violations of the non-aggression principle are, by definition, an initiation of force. Do you see what I'm saying? So it does have that objective quality because of that.
Yeah. Okay, Matthew. So let me ask you. So with the private property society, if someone were to ask me, what is required of me to move in the direction of a private society or bring about a private society, my answer would be very, very simple. Well, recognize your own property, private property, and recognize everybody else's. It's really, really that simple. With your non-aggression principle as a starting point in these drawing of lines, what would you say to a person who wants to get to your type of society? What are the steps that would have to be taken?
Do what you want as long as you don't initiate force against peaceful people.
Yeah, but you're also drawing lines. So who decides where those lines are drawn, and how does that line drawing come about?
I mean, the principle basically defines either side, and with regards to that line that I mentioned in part 2, what you're doing is you're saying if there's any area where it's hard to, where you can't say for certain that this is exactly where the line should be drawn from an objective point of view, for whatever reason, like I say, with the abortion thing, let's say, for example, there's debate in the scientific community as to when a fetus becomes, a human to the degree of it would be murder to kill it.
Right.
So let's say that. Where that line is, let's say there's argument over that. That doesn't change the fact that murder is a violation of the non-aggression principle. The problem is we don't have the sophistication to be able to come to an objective decision as to when this organism becomes a sentient being by how we would define it. So what I'm saying is you do have these fuzzy edges, but it's not like the law's being made up by democratic consensus. The law is being established by a principle, and the principle is very clear and objective, but I cannot deny, and I won't deny, because I'm got to be honest about this, I can't deny that there are going to be certain areas, but they're very minutiae areas, where we are going to have to draw a line that what I would call the limits of tolerance. I mean, I call it the lines in the sand. But it's just adding that extra definition. And in the case of, like, for example, the abortion thing, it's like say, well, okay, perhaps we don't know 100%, and there can be room for disagree, but we can say 100% certain that at this point, without doubt, some might say it's a bit earlier, but here, without doubt, the child is definitely now a sentient being, and if you kill it, it's murder, so you can't abort it at this stage or whatever. What I'm saying is we draw a line. This is our limits of tolerance. This is where we're saying, okay, here you're definitely violating the non-aggression principle. There might be debate, but here you're definitely violating it. And the reason why we need to draw that line is because even though the non-aggression principle I think it makes it self-evident in kind of 99% of the cases, but I've got to admit, I can't deny it, there are areas where you're going to have fuzzy edges, where there's going to be room for debate. And what I'm saying is you just draw a line around that then and say, okay, well, we can only enforce what's definitely a violation of the non-aggression principle. And if we want to start dealing with more specific ideals, like with the age of consent thing, let's say we say, right, at this point, definitely a child. So we don't care what society you're in, you're violating the non-aggression principle if you try to have sex with a child of this young or whatever. But what we're saying is even if, let's say that line doesn't meet with everybody's sensibilities. Well, so I don't want to associate with a society that goes that low. So even though I accept that the universal law cuts it off at this point, I'm going to only associate and only be part of societies or only trade with or however I want to exercise my preference, just like you described about people moving into property near each other. Like I say, that option is still available to people to get that extra definition and get that extra detail and to deal, like I say, the non-aggression principle isn't covering everything, it's just covering the bases. It's just saying, okay, this is the line that defines crime, and then you can all agree to disagree beyond that, and you can all associate in your different ways, and we will accept, but within the bounds of the non-aggression principle. So I'm kind of saying the same thing as you, but I'm saying, but you have to have the non-aggression principle above that. And where you're saying that you don't need the non-aggression principle above that, my problem is, well then if you don't have the non-aggression principle there, then you're opening up the possibilities, at least, of moral relativism, even if it's not actively endorsing it, it's allowing it to exist. And my point is whether or not it's right, whether or not it's a good idea for you to invade your neighbour's property because he's violating the non-aggression principle in horrific ways that you just can't stand. What I'm saying is my society says that you have the right to. Whether you have the resources or not to is another issue. Whether it would be wise for you for your own safety or not is another issue. But it's giving you a principle. It's saying there is a right and wrong. There's other rights and wrongs that we can disagree with and all the rest of it, and they're down to personal preference, but there's actually a universal right and wrong as well. There is a universal foundation that defines crime by an objective standard, and it's something that you can enforce without ever initiating force on anybody, because it's, by definition, it would be an act of defense to enforce it. Does that make sense?
Actually, no. I get what you're saying, but who is the we that is going to decide on these fuzzy issues where the line is drawn? It sounds to me that somehow you're taking it and you're making it majority rule or something. Well, or if you're arguing it's a morality, whose morality? Is it the Muslim morality? Is it Christian morality?
It's non-aggression principle first. You only allow, let's say you did it democratically, let's say that's how the lines were drawn. What I'm saying is the lines still have to be drawn within the non-aggression principle. There's only room for debate in these fuzzy edges. There's not room to debate beyond that. I think this is a good way of explaining, actually, because I even have an article called Where the Desert Meets the Grassland. And what it's basically saying is you from a geographical point of view, you have deserts and then you have grasslands. And then you have an area in between where one gradually becomes the other. Like say that the grassland becomes more arid until eventually you're in the desert, and vice versa. Now, what I'm saying is the desert's definitely the desert, and the grassland's definitely the grassland. But there might be an area in between that's just a little bit more difficult to define. Now, that doesn't negate the fact that the desert's the desert and the grassland's the grassland. It just means that reasonable people can disagree in this little in-between area where you might have the odd patch of grass. See what I'm saying? Yep. So what I'm saying is, yes, you might, let's say we, and I'm open to people that want to debate whether this is the way to go, but let's say we democratically do part two. You've still got part one that's saying the non-aggression principle is the law. So you've still got part one saying that the desert is the desert and the grassland is the grassland. And okay, we'll let people democratically decide where we're going to draw the line. But the thing is, we're not going to let people democratically decide, because we can say to people within that area, that in-between area, some people can say, okay, well, we think the line should be here, so we'll only associate with people that agree with us that the line is here. And then other people say, well, we only want to associate with people that agree with us with the line here. Okay, but when we get to a point where there's no qualities of grassland, it's just sand all around you, you're definitely in the desert. Then you're definitely in the desert. And when you're in an area where there's no quality of deserts, it's only grassland, there's no sand to be seen, then you're definitely in the grassland. So we'll let the reasonable people disagree about that little area in between, and what we'll do is in that case, we'll draw two lines either side.
You haven't seen my
lawn. Sorry?
I said you haven't seen my lawn, but that's it. Go ahead.
But you see the point I'm making, though. What I'm saying is that there is still, that you can still objectively say that the desert is the desert and the grassland is the grassland. Just like the non-aggression principle can still say that rape is a crime, consensual sex is not. There's still that thing. But what I'm saying is so the existence of this fuzzy edge doesn't mean that you can infect the black and white. You see what I mean? There's a grey area, fine.
Yeah, no, I get that. The fuzzy edge exists, and the problem is, how do we deal with that fuzzy edge?
To give you an example, I can't imagine how much sway the Islamic ideology could have in that area, because it's like, well, they've still got to work within the non-aggression principles, so they can't have any of this Sharia law nonsense because that's an outright violation. You know, you're not in that fuzzy area then. You're standing in the middle of the desert with nothing but sand around you. Do you see what I mean? So what I'm saying is yes, perhaps that fuzzy edge would be something that people would have to negotiate voluntarily in between, and we'll have to draw objective lines either side where, you know, and only deal in the area that's definitely black and white and leave the grey for people to sort out through voluntary associations. So, like I say, it might be a case of drawing one line.
Sounds private property society.
Sorry, say again.
Sounds private property society to me.
Well, like I say, what I'm saying is a lot of the qualities you talk about, of what you can have in the private property society, you still have in there. So yeah, I am going to talk about a lot of things that you said that you can have in what you've got. You know, like when you said about on the plane, well, you know, people in your private property society, people can make agreements that a doctor's allowed to do this and what have you, and stop the confusion. Yeah, you can have that in the NAP society as well. There are, like I say, there are crossovers here. It's not like everything's conflicting in every aspect of, you know, what we're both presenting. There is areas where it's the same, but what I'm saying is I suppose my contention is you need the non-aggression principle above that, because it's setting what's right and wrong. It's saying, what I'm saying is in your society, the desert and the grassland aren't even being distinguished from each other at all. Forget about the area in between. It's not even declaring the desert as the desert and the grassland as the grassland, let alone the area in between. So I suppose the one thing I'm saying that the NAP is at least doing is it's at least saying the desert's the desert, and it's at least saying the grassland's the grassland. And when it's in black and white, everybody will know where they stand, even if there are fuzzy. And to be honest, the fuzzy edges are very small and very sparse. But that doesn't mean they don't exist. And like I say, it's right that you bring it up, and it's an important point. And I can't deny that these little areas do exist. But what I'm saying is they don't completely devalue the principle. They don't make the whole principle subjective just because there might be some areas.
Yes.
You see what I'm saying? The desert's still the desert and the grassland's the grassland.
Yeah, no, I do. But see, that's where I see the danger. First of all, if you're going to be imposing the non-aggression principle on everyone, I mean, it's really sort of being imposed on everyone somehow, and there can be no deviations from that. But secondly, recognizing these fuzzy areas results in some doors that have to open beyond the non-aggression principle. And then what you've got is you have to get a determination of how to resolve these fuzzy areas. And so you're going to have to open the door even further to democracy or science. You know, I don't know how you resolve. But
there would still be a limit to it. That's my point. I mean, just to give you one more example, and I don't want to sort of bore you with too many examples, but just give you one more example, or just to go back to an example with the age of consent thing. Let's just say, for argument's sake, that we drew two lines with regards to age of consent, because we say, okay, this is a fuzzy area. We can't say objectively 100% when someone moves from being a vulnerable child that can't consent to anything to being an adult that fully owns themselves and is responsible for their own actions and can consent to whatever they like. We can't draw that exact line. So what we're going to do is we'll draw two lines. We're going to draw one line that's the limit of how low people can go, and there's another line that's the limit of how high people can go. And let's just say, for example, that it was 14 to 21. Let's just use that. It might be 12 to 21 to allow for tribal people, whatever. But let's just say that the international standard was, and what they're basically saying is different societies can work within that to negotiate their own standards within that. So just like now, England, I mean, the age of consent is different depending on what the thing is. So, I mean, and that's something that would be different in a free society. If you're an adult, you're an adult. If you're not, you're not. So, you know, it would apply to all things. But in England, for example, the age of consent for sex is 16, but the age of consent for alcohol is 18. But let's just say it was 16 across the board. But then in Germany, it's 14. And then, like in parts of America, it's like 21 or something, or I don't know what it is, but, and I know it's different from state to state. But what I'm saying is if you had this minimum and maximum of where people can go, you can have these different societies and different voluntary collectives that have their own preferences. I don't want to say, I don't want to be in a society where people go lower than 18. I think it is sick to, for people below 18 to be given adult rights to consent to things like sex and drugs and enter into legal contracts and all that sort of stuff. So let's say that, you know, my personal sensibilities say that. So I'm only going to associate with people of 18. But the international standard, the standard that all societies have to abide by, is they can't go lower than 12 or 14 or wherever we decide to draw that line, because we say, okay, at that point, because that's why I call it the lines in the sand. It's the limits of tolerance. We're saying there are areas that are subjective, but just because there are areas that are subjective, that doesn't mean that people can take the mick and stretch things into absurdity. Just because there's this area between the desert and the grassland doesn't mean you can go walking miles into the desert and call it grassland, or vice versa. Do you see what I'm saying? So that's what I'm saying. You have that, you draw that, that's what part 2 is about. It's about drawing those lines to make sure that the grey area is recognised and accepted, but separated from what we're establishing as law. Because as you rightly say, establishing as law means we're imposing it on people. So if we're going to boast that the non-aggression principle is an objective standard that's universalizable and something that we can enforce on people without violating their freedom, then we need to stick to the objective standard of what is. So, you know, if we're going to say, right, you violate the non-aggression principle, so we're allowed to use force to stop you, we better be able to say objectively that you violated the non-aggression principle. We can't do, you know, and like I say, if we want to, and with regards to those grey areas, that's when we do the same thing that you can do in your society, which is to deal with that thing. But what I'm saying is your society doesn't draw the limits to that. So people can, on their own societies, rape and murder and do all these things. I'm not saying you're endorsing that. I realise, of course, you're not, and you wouldn't want that. But what I'm saying is there's nothing in your society that says that that can't happen. You're saying the only stipulation is that you do what you want on your own property. As great as that is, that's not enough. You need to have the non-aggression principle above that, which I suppose it's more comprehensive. I suppose what I'm saying is what you've got is missing. I mean, obviously, I'm going to say that because I think that the world is missing the non-aggression principle as law. You know, obviously, this is something that I'm pushing, just as what you've created is something that, you know, that you think is the way to go. So obviously, we're going to disagree on this, but and I didn't expect to change your mind or you change my mind or whatever. But one of the reasons why I wanted to have this conversation was I thought it was interesting for us, because I wanted to hear your arguments and I wanted you to hear mine, because one of the things about our ideas, and I'm sure you can appreciate this, is we want to challenge them and test them and, you know, and put them through these kind of thought experiments and hypotheticals so that we can perhaps examine them more and see if we recognise holes in our own philosophy, as well as, you know, trying to understand other people's. And so you know, I obviously appreciate, you know, you going through all of this. But
yeah, Matthew, and I do too. I mean, exactly. I think this is one of the best debates I've been involved in, because it's really, we're both probing each other on our own thinking, and I think it's extremely valuable to do that, especially with a worthy opposition such as yourself. And you're solid with the non-aggression principle and the ideas there. And I mean, we could go on. I mean, I still would want to push the idea of, how exactly these fuzzy laws are drawn. And it seems to me that it's very, very close to you probably haven't formulated exactly who's drawing these lines, whereas my private property society does that in the sense that it's saying, draw your line. You on your own property get to draw your own lines, whereas I'm not sure it's clear on your end who gets to draw the lines. And so there tends to be some kind of overruling body with regard to the non-aggression principle perspective here on the fuzzy point things. And but I think we're much closer than you think. And then as far as the non-aggression principle, I'm fully in your camp. Once the private property society is adopted, that the best method, I think, for most people, but they can do whatever they want, would be to adopt non-aggression principle rules. So in its a way, it's almost like we're just changing the rankings as to what comes first. Does private property come first and then non-aggression, or does non-aggression and then than private property
Yeah, I
under
think
that.
that's a fair assessment. I mean, I suppose, and just to give one final case for why I think non-aggression principle goes above private property, is because obviously a lot of what you talk about property rights and your right to do what you want on your property, although I obviously add the caveat of as long as it's within the realms of the non-aggression principle, I basically agree with that sentiment, and that's obviously one of the areas where we've got common ground with regards to what we're both representing.
Right.
But the reason why I kind of put the non-aggression, I suppose from my perspective, the non-aggression principle is what gives you property rights. It's what, like the only reason you have a rightful ownership to property, and I know you don't deal with the rightful side of it so much, but from my perspective, the only reason you have a rightful ownership of property is because of the extension of the self-ownership that the non-aggression principle gives you. You own yourself, you own the product of your labour, you can own property by, creation or voluntary trade, again, or any kind of, like I say, by defining rightful ownership, it lays down the foundations for the property rights for the sort of private property that you're talking about. And I suppose, in many ways, a society that built on what you're advocating may well look a lot like a society that I do in practice, if either one ever came to fruition, I suppose. But my concern is without the non-aggression principle, your society could look like all kinds of other things as well. And even if they're unlikely, my concern is there's nothing written into the definition. And I suppose that's why, apart from the fact that I think that without the non-aggression principle, you don't really have a solid case for property rights, at least from, a rights point of view. And, even with your movement saying, well, people can do what they want on their own property, it's like, well, why can they do what they want? It's like, there's always there's still that annoying child in me that always has to say why to everything. And it's like, well, why can you do what you want on your own? What's the principle behind that? That's what I liked about the non-aggression principle, is it provided a why behind everything. Instinctively, most people know that rape's wrong, theft's wrong, murder's wrong. Instinctively, people often know this. But if people actually examine why, examine the principle, what's the common principle that runs through all these things that I know in my heart's wrong, or right or wrong, but, once you do the work, with regards to actually thinking about the principle, you find that there is this one principle that runs through pretty much everything that we can rationally define as a crime. And then everything else that we agree or disagree with, we can still agree or disagree with. And like I say, my personal morality isn't tied only to the non-aggression principle. I obviously gave the example of racism being something that I personally have a problem with, but understand fully that the non-aggression principle has no opinion on it whatsoever. Because it's nothing, because it's not a violation, it's not a crime, but it's still something that I personally disagree with. It's not a crime not to help people. In fact, one example, and this will be my final thing to say, because I know we've spoken for quite a while, but one example I love to give about the non-aggression principle when I try to sum up in real simple terms is I kind of picture the stereotypical old lady struggling to cross the street. What I'm saying is the non-aggression principle doesn't say that you have to help that lady across the street. It doesn't say that you shouldn't either. It makes no comment on whether you should or shouldn't. My personal morality says that you should help the lady across the street, but the non-aggression principle doesn't say that. But what the non-aggression principle does say is that you shouldn't mug her, or you shouldn't hurt her in any way. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's drawing that line and saying people can have their own moralities, but you still need something underneath that defines crime. And the reason why I think this law needs to be established as the terms of peace for a peace agreement, apart from the fact that would be the only way to establish a law without a government, is because that's what law basically is. It's the terms of peace. It's basically saying if you violate this law, then you're breaking the peace. You're aggressing against us. And if you're going to make that claim, then it needs to be objectively that someone is actually aggressing. And if someone's gambling or smoking weed or having gay sex or all the other million of things that there's been laws against in the past or at present, no one can say that that's a crime by any objective standard, because there's no there's no aggression against anybody there. But when you deal with things like rape, murder, theft, and assault, and all of those, and trespassing of property and destruction of property, and all of that, then there is this fundamental principle that runs through all of those and draws, I would say, an objective line that defines them as crimes.
Yeah. No, I get. I mean, much of what you say in your perspective on the non-aggression principle, I would adopt this as the rules on my private property, and I think many other people would do that, or at least I think it would be to their benefit to do so. So I have no objections there. My objection, of course, is how is that introduced? And it seems that the fuzzy lines and the determination that everybody has to accept the NAP somehow suggests something occurring before this. And I don't know if you base it on utilitarianism, natural rights, or something else, but I think that's a problem, because whereas you charge that the private property society could lead to very bad things, which it could in the very, very, very extremely unlikely people that everybody's evil to begin with. That's the only way that could happen. But in your society where there's rules are being made, my objection is to overall rules is that the bad guys go after them. In Chapter 10 of The Road to Serfdom, Hayek made clear that the worst get on top because they will do what it takes to gain control. So my whole focus in the private property society is to never have such overriding rules whereby the bad guys can get control of them, whether they're just backdoor stuff versus the NAP, and then somehow establishing what the rules are on fuzzy stuff. The bad guys know how to use that stuff to gain more and more control. So I see that kind of perspective as potentially leading to something very, very bad, whereas the NAP, it would just, if people adopt the NAP, there's nothing that's going to create a problem on a property where people want to accept the NAP.
Yeah. I mean, I understand what you're saying. I suppose from my point of view, it's like, yeah, I appreciate the fact that, on your property, people would respect the NAP, and on people you associate, people would respect the NAP, and we'd hope most people would do that and have those rules on their property. I suppose in the society I advocate for is I'm saying, well, if your neighbour doesn't respect the NAP, we have a right to use force against him. We're saying it's the only situation when we do have a right to use force against him, and that's why it's such a serious issue, and that's why you have to draw it down to the most basic and objective standard that you can, which is what I think the NAP represents of defining what is a crime. Because like I say, because by definition a violation of the NAP is an initiation of force, then by definition enforcing it is nothing but an act of defence. And because it's established as the terms of peace for a peace agreement, there's no power to seize. I mean, that's kind of one of the motivations, or at least that's how I view it. One of my motivations with regards to this, and one of the things that I think that makes it the ideal solution is that old saying about power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and I do see that as very true. And I look at, well, what's the solution to that? And I think, well, get rid of that power. If the non-aggression principle was the law, then the power to rule people would itself be illegal. Like any ruling government would be illegal under the NAP as law. This drawing lines on the fuzzy edges is just a sad reality. It's something that will just have to be done when you put this into practice. You're going to have to draw those lines, and we're going to have to make sure they are, completely objective. And like I say, we're going to have to draw them where it's definitely the desert, and there can be no argument. There's not a speck of grass in sight. and then on the other side, where there's not a speck of sand in sight. And we're going to have to accept that there's a fuzzy edge in between where we can't impose on people, and we're going to have to use this voluntary association that you're talking about in your society. We are going to have to fall back on that, but only in the fuzzy edges. We shouldn't be doing that when it comes to things like rape and murder and theft. We shouldn't be allowing our neighbours to get away with what is a crime. We can let our neighbours get away with things that we don't personally agree with on a subjective level, but when we deal with what is objectively a crime, and as I say, I do assert that that does define what is a crime objectively. You don't have a right to go onto your neighbour's property and tell him to stop smoking weed, but you do have a right to go onto your neighbour's property and stop him if he's in the middle of murdering somebody or raping somebody or any other violation of the non-aggression principle. Obviously, responses have to be proportionate, and that's in itself another conversation which we could probably talk about for a long time. But do you see what I'm saying, though? That's kind of like my thinking behind it, and I do appreciate the points you're raising, because a lot of these, like I say, particularly with regards to the fuzzy edges, that's why the agreement changed from initially, when the Nations of Sanity was first conceived, it was just, let's make the NAP the law, and let's do it through a peace agreement. There was no three parts to it, but the more that idea was examined, and the more you looked at the putting it into practice, the more the sort of points that you raised today in this conversation came up, and you can't deny it. There's no denying it. So it's like, well, what do we do with that? If we're actually going to put it into place, it's not enough for people to just agree to the NAP's law. We also need to agree where we're drawing our lines, our limits of tolerance, where we say, okay, now, there might be a grey area there, but there's not a grey area here. This line is drawn, and now you're definitely, like I say, going back to the desert and grassland thing, now you're definitely in the desert, and there's no argument against it. There's not a speck of grass you can point to say that you're anywhere other than the desert right now. And like I say, most issues, the non-aggression principle will lay it down black and white, so you don't need to worry about democratic consensus or whatever else is going to draw the line in that fuzzy edge. I actually think in many cases it would be better to draw two lines around the fuzzy edge and just let the fuzzy edge be dealt with through voluntary agreements. Like I say, with the age of consent, draw a line for your minimum, draw a line for your maximum, and then let people voluntarily associate in between, and just accept the fact that we cannot draw a more precise line than that, because we just don't have the sophistication to be objective in that level of precision. But that doesn't mean, like I say, it's important to acknowledge the subjective area, but it is equally important not to let that little tiny sliver of grey infect these big black and white areas that are solid. And like I say, going with the desert grassland thing, just because there's this area where reasonable people can disagree on desert and grassland, that doesn't mean that when you're actually standing in the middle of the desert and there's nothing but sand around you, that doesn't mean we can still have an argument about whether we're in the grassland. Then it's black and white, and we would draw a line when you're getting to that level of absurdity. Does that make sense? Regardless of
not to me. I get it. Yeah. No. I get what you're saying, and it's basically I just wonder who's drawing these lines, but.
It's a fair point. It's a fair concern. Like I say, and that's why, that's why I say sometimes you will have to just say, okay, we can't draw a precise line, but here we can say for certain. And like I say, you still use the principle. That's why it's not just three parts. For the sake of, it's not just that you need these three parts, but you also need them in that order. Part one is agreeing that it's the non-aggression principle that defines the law. That's part one. So then when you get to part two about drawing the exact lines, you've already got part one that's telling you, okay, well, this is what's defining crime. And then we're just drawing these precise lines so everybody knows where they stand moving forward. These are our limits of tolerance. In case you wondered, this is the age where we say, no, you're definitely a child. In case you wondered, this is the point where we say, no, you're definitely violating the non-aggression principle in whatever area it is, whether it's, abortion. Like I say, most things it's black and white. If you rob someone, you rob someone. If you punch someone, you assault them. Most things are black and white. But like I say, there are these little grey areas where there's room for disagreement, and it's fine to acknowledge that, but we restrict that to the grey area. We don't let that infect and let people push interpretations into absurdity where it becomes meaningless, where, again, to sort of go labour the same metaphor, but again, we can't have a situation where someone's going to stand in the middle of the desert where there's not a speck of grass and say, I'm in the grassland right now. You can't have that. And like I say, in the society I'm going, I spoke to, I don't know if you know a guy called Patrick Smith from Disenthralled, but I spoke to him about an issue that a lot of ANCAPs were debating on whether or not it's a violation of the non-aggression principle to have a doorbell bomb. And I know that sounds absurd, but we like to deal with absurdities sometimes when it comes to examining the principles. And one of the things that I was realising when I was sort of discussing this, because me and Patrick, again, good example, both understand the non-aggression principle, agree on 99.9% of it, but we disagreed on exactly where you draw the line there. And the one thing I realised was, okay, perhaps when we get into real extreme absurdities and, perhaps the line will be drawn somewhere where I don't think it should be. But it's going to be, like I say, it's going to be in that subjective area. And I can at least admit, again, going back to the desert guy, I can at least say, okay, well, he's saying that this is the grassland. There is grass here, so even though I don't think it's the grassland yet, because I still see a bit of sand, I can accept that point. But at least we're not in a position where we're standing in the middle of the desert calling it the grassland or vice versa. And things like the basic right to rule people that no one should have is clear and black and white. Laws that violate people's right to their self-ownership, like drug laws, gambling laws, prostitution laws, tax laws, are a non-starter. There's no argument for them at all. There's no way of saying that you're aggressing against someone when you smoke a joint or when you gamble or when you do any of these other things, when you're exercising your own free will. Just like there's no argument that you're not violating anyone when you rape someone or you murder someone. These things are black and white. And just because there is an area, like I say, and I'm not going to deny it, I hear a lot of people try to pretend that this doesn't exist. And I push back against that because I think they're trying to ignore it because it's inconvenient. And it is inconvenient. It's inconvenient to what I'm promoting. So I'm not going to pretend it's not there, but I don't think it destroys the entire principle. Just like the lifeboat scenario doesn't destroy the principle. Just like, even though reasonable people can say that they think that it's right for a person to steal a loaf of bread, particularly from a wealthy person that can afford to lose it to feed their family. These extreme examples, our own personal preference comes into it, but it doesn't change the basic objective principle. I don't think it infects that, as long as we don't let it, as long as we draw those lines. And again, that's why that agreement is a three-part agreement, and that's why those three parts are in that order. Maybe you might disagree that it does guard against it successfully, but that is the reason why they're there. From my perspective, it is, I do recognise the concerns you've raised, and these things are put in place with that in mind. So I do see where you're coming from.
Yeah. Again, I don't really see us that far apart. I think it's both of us just looking a little bit differently on how to establish really a civilized society where exchange goes on, where there is no interference from government. You seem to think that some borders need to be established somehow, and I see the danger being that some kind of entity or method has to be used to establish those borders beyond just acceptance of private property. But I think we're very, very, very close, and this is, I think, been an extremely valuable discussion.
I agree.
We planned for an hour, we're going over 2 hours now. I think it's
we'll probably should wrap it up now, because as you say, we spoke for 2 hours. But I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. I knew it would be an enjoyable conversation because I knew we'd have common grounds, and I also knew we'd have areas of disagreement. And I even I find both interesting to discuss because, for different reasons. The areas of disagreement are really interesting to me because I like to challenge my ideas and I like to, put through these tests and thought experiments and all the rest of it. It's been great. I really, really enjoyed it, and I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to me about this.
Yeah, and we'll have to do it again. Continue on.
Definitely. I'd be happy to have this conversation again. So yeah, definitely.
Okay, Matthew.
Thank
Good
you very
talking.
much, Robert. Thank you.
Take care.